Today, we'll be hosting our keynote conversation panel, followed by a pro-action cafe, where we'll come together for a creative conversation to move ideas and projects into action. We'll also be drawing our door prize at the end of the pro-action cafe, so please stick around for your chance to win a gift basket of locally made and fair trade goods. So this morning, we're thrilled for this keynote conversation panel titled Creating Change, Overcoming Obstacles and Implementation Opportunities, with a focus on how a global turning point like this one can translate into long-term, sustainable, just, and equitable change. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So if you have any questions throughout the conversation, please post them in the chat and we'll compile them for the discussions at the end. Our panel is going to be moderated this morning by Kaylee Wong. Kaylee Wong is in her last year of her concurrent degree program at Dalhousie, studying engineering and international development studies. Outside of schoolwork, she works as a reservist in the Canadian Army and has focused much of her advocacy work on creating a more equitable military. She has previously worked with ACIC as a program associate and is excited to be moderating this year's Symposium keynote. So welcome, Kaylee, and over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that lovely introduction. Yes, I'm super excited, as I said, to be moderating the keynote because I had some role in actually developing the themes of this symposium back when I worked with ACIC for the summer. So it's very exciting for me to see the full circle come and me be able to actually have these discussions on the topics that I helped develop. So it's my great honor to introduce our panelists for the keynote of the 2021 Symposium for ACIC. So first I'll introduce Noli Guzman. Can you give me a thumbs up if that's correct pronunciation? Okay, cool. She is a Bolivian feminist and anti-colonial student and organizer focused on the expansion of Chinese capital in the Amazon from an indigenous feminist geographical perspective. She has also co-founded Jazi Renee, an eco-feminist organization based in La Paz, Bolivia. She also has a master's degree in Latin American studies from the University of Texas and has also begun her PhD studies in geography at UCLA this year. Additionally, she has also authored the book Chinese Capitalism in the Amazon, Disposable Bodies Behind 3 Infrastructure Projects in Bolivia. I'm learning Spanish right now, so I was going to give an attempt at trying to say it in the original title before, but I think I'll save everyone that, that pronunciation. And on top of all of this, she's been coordinating both medical and emotional emergency support for Amazonian indigenous communities during the COVID-19 outbreak, as it has overlapped with the Amazon floods and fires. So thrilled to have you, Noli. And then secondly, we have Farah Kabir. Farah has been working with Action in Bangladesh as the country director since 2007 for close to over, and she has close to over 3 decades of vast experience in the field of development and research. And this has made her a renowned human rights figure at home and abroad with an uncompromising voice against human rights violations. As a recipient of the prestigious Nawab Ali Chaudhuri National Award of 2012, Farah has made significant contributions to the Bangladeshi women's rights movement. She's actively engaged in the development of the Sendai framework on DRR, SDGs, and the Paris Agreement. She's also led ActionAid to win the UN Sasakawa Award for Disaster Risk Reduction and the Momentum for Change 2013 Lighthouse Activity on Climate Change Adaptation and Disaster Risk Resilience in Bangladesh. And additionally, she has also co-edited 2 publications of her own, Discourse Analysis as a Tool for Understanding Gender Identity, Representation, and Equality, and Revealing Gender Equality, Inequalities and Perceptions in South Asian Countries Through Discourse Analysis. Obviously, we have a wealth of knowledge and experience present for today's keynote, so I'd like to thank you both for making the time to join us and give us your thoughts on some of the themes of this year's symposium. So to start us off, I suppose we can tackle kind of the premise of this symposium, in that the backdrop to everything we're discussing is the COVID-19 pandemic that has kind of shaken the world for the past almost 2 years. So during this process, some would say that we've seen an increase in awareness and participation in social movements throughout the course of the pandemic. So from police brutality to affordable housing to AAPI racism to accessible healthcare. What do you think has contributed to the increased engagement on these social issues during this very unique time in history of the global pandemic? I invite either of you to go first, and I'd love to hear from the other one after.
Oh, I thought Noelle was going to go because I was so impressed with her work, and I was waiting to hear from you. Would you like to go first?
Okay, I can go first. And yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for this space. Like I feel so humbled to be here to share with like such prominent people like you, Kaylee, and Dr. Farah is just absolutely amazing. I think like you say, like you were saying, Kaylee, regarding the question, I just think that the pandemic sort of unmasked a lot of the problems that the pre-existing problems that we were dealing with before before the official quote unquote crisis began, right? Like I think the pandemic and COVID-19, what COVID-19 did was to make explicit that we have been living for a while in a state of emergency, and really there was this sensation of like unmasking again how state institutions like the whole medical complex like home in and of itself needed to be rethinked, and like we really needed to revisit how we were configuring those spaces, how we have been sort of rolling with the horrors of everyday life, right? Like education, how the pandemic just unmasked huge huge enormous gaps in education for a lot of people in my home country in Bolivia. A lot of students who weren't able, like who weren't in private schools, they needed to literally shut down their studies and help at home and work, and that's creating like it's broadening a pre-existing gap. I think violence against women at home, just like the explosion of those cases was absolutely like it was painful to see, to watch, and for a lot of women to experience. And I think in this sense the pandemic operated as a pressure cooker that made everything like all the things that were kind of that we were sort of tolerating before, and like we were, like I said, like we were kind of rolling with it. Suddenly we realized that there's actually no time and there's actually no room and no one can tolerate that anymore, and that we needed to start acting now. Like like I think the message that came across for me is, hey, this system that we've been sort of believing in is actually broken. It's actually not working. It's falling apart, and we are seeing it falling apart. And we need something else. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely agree with you, Noelle, and thank you so much, Kelly, for those kind words and introduction. I think 2020 and 2021, with the outbreak of the pandemic, suddenly halted all of us. We were all crazily running, and there was so little time for reflection, or even to take a moment off and see what are we running for and where are we going. And we were trying to, it's like, Tom and Jerry, where he gets hit and suddenly this part pops up, you push it back, and then it passes. The system across the world was like that, Band-Aid, and trying to just address things superficially. And then the pandemic exposed it, that the health structure, the education system, the gender-based violence, the whole necessity to work around disaster risk reduction or climate were really not working out. And the priorities of the global leadership or national political actors were far from pro-people, definitely not in the interest of what they call the masses or the citizens. It was for the 1%. So that differentiated state of affairs became sharper during the COVID system. Now, of course, we might try to take a broad brush and talk about what happened during the COVID. And there was so much about the North and the South conflict, because the technology, the vaccine politics, again exposed that developed country versus developing LDC countries, the North and the South, then the and somehow it took a long time, in fact, for people to realize that no one is safe unless everyone is safe. This was one moment, one time, one issue, the COVID, the coronavirus, which was not going to spare anyone. And for instance, in my country, the people, the 1% or those who could afford would go to Bangkok or Singapore for treatment. Suddenly, they could not go anywhere. They may have had the money, but they could not access the best of the best medical facilities. They had to accept what was in the country. So in that sense, there was a sense of realization, there was a disruption, there was also a moment of reflection. But what we found, that new groups of people, new youth communities who came forward, because suddenly when there was the lockdown, and particularly this impacted the informal sector, people who work in the informal sector, loss of jobs, loss of accommodation, students, because a lot of our students live in the university campuses, and to be able to live in the campuses, they take on any kind of work. They do tuitioning, they work in fast food places. Nothing was available anymore, and they all had to move back to wherever they came from, the villages. And in fact, in Bangladesh, I would say our rural areas were better prepared than in many other countries to support them. And luckily, we had enough food. So the informal sector, the people, wage earners and all were affected way more than the business community or the corporate community. And we saw that not the traditional groups, but a lot of young people came out and supported them. They tried and distributed food. They tried to help them as best as they can. However, when something continues over a 2-year period, it cannot work without the state mechanism supporting, the state machinery being there. So we had to work also in a way where, using the digital platforms, using technology, and doing our advocacy and lobbying, and a lot of online communication. That transition we had to make, and it was easy for an organization than it was for communities, for individuals. But so we tried to work them, and all our advocacy and lobbying for most of 2020 and in 2021 has been through the digital and online. But that also gave us an understanding of how big the digital divide was. And it was it is definitely a gendered scenario. So yeah, but the exciting parts were the new groups, the young people, the people coming together to support each other. So I can go on, but I'll come back again.
No, thank you for that from both of you. Yes, and the role of social media, I think, cannot be separated from the movements of this pandemic. And we will get into that later. It's one of my questions, but I wanted to point to something you said, Farah, in that international leaders, national leaders are not, or historically have not been pro-people, as you put. But the pandemic in many ways has acted as the great equalizer. This issue does not stop at socioeconomic classes. It does not stop at political borders. Do you think that this pandemic has made us and our leadership thereby more human-centric following this pandemic? Or do you still have doubts?
I would love to say a yes, but it's not a yes, because I think when the uncertainties were high, there was a humility among the political actors because they didn't know what to, but as with the time, with the vaccine being developed, with partial opening, businesses, corporates, and then again going back to lockdowns and so on, this experiment took away that humility. And again, the leadership is behaving not as we would like them to behave. And this is true when you look at issues of climate justice and the call for action there. It is so slow. It is also true when it comes to the issues of gender-based discrimination, gender-based violence. I mean, they're willing to send people. I mean, it's wonderful to see that Captain Kirk goes to space and comes back. My childhood, when the Star Trek was on, it all seemed impossible. So that's fantastic. But I'm sure there could be good use of that money for the community, or when they're buying more arms and ammunition and going into conflict. I'm sure that could be used for the welfare of the people and so on. So that is there. And also the accountability again has slipped, because it comes back to, political actors are accountable during elections, and all the other systems and mechanisms, at least in developing countries, in many parts of the world I've seen, are not functioning the way they should. They're not being able to hold the political actors. So I don't want to sound skeptical, because I want to also highlight that young people, women, they find a way around it and they're coping. So adaptation is high. But my question is, why should we have to cope? Why shouldn't we be delivering on an equity basis?
Absolutely. And why should this burden be on marginalized groups and women? Ultimately, the fundamental question. And you both talked about, this pandemic has not, the issues that have emerged are nothing new: gender-based violence, discrimination, racism in a variety of different racialized groups are nothing new. It's just that the pandemic has made these issues unignorable. When women cannot leave their homes and they're subject to domestic abuse, that becomes an issue that we cannot push aside. Anti-Asian racism has always been there, but pandemic offered a very easy scapegoat for that to come out in mainstream media. So when we see this mobilization around these social movements coming from the pandemic, as I think we all know, institutions are often slow to change, but do you see that this engagement and mobilization in this unique moment right now is or can translate into true institutional or policy change? And have you seen that in your work? Noli, maybe if you want to start us off here.
Yeah, sure. I frankly don't know if like the transformations that are being like sort of weaved from like in grassroots, from grassroots organizations of movements can, I don't know, like translated in policy, and like, I'm not sure. I am a little bit skeptical about that. I think that and I think COVID is one of the reasons why I'm skeptical, right? Like, I think there were so many promises, there were so many like, I think COVID was a moment in which we saw the ways in which all the things that were promised, all the projects and all the change that was supposed to be happening and to have been, that was supposed to have been happening, just like it wasn't there, and I think and so I don't know about that, but I certainly think that that the answer, if anything, and like, I guess, rolling with the skepticism and playing with it a little bit, I think really what COVID has taught the world is how many, like how big of a transformation we can make by like articulating communities with each other, or like just organizing in smaller like spheres and smaller groups of people, like in a neighborhood, in like I don't know, like with your community. I think those expressions of solidarity really shook like in like sparked questions, I think, for a lot of people, realizing or like that we're already kind of yeah, like kind of that lost faith in like like formal political systems, and rather started asking or like sparked questions about how we can not replace policy level, because obviously not, but like uh, what are the initiatives that we can push and that are actually making immediate transformations in for everyone's lives, right? And I think when I think about these, like I I want to mention one of the few cases that I know that has done this in like from say from above, right? Like from a position of like that is not necessarily in the grassroots or part of the grassroots organizations. Um, and it's there is an organization, it's Fondo Socioambiental Casa. It's a Brazilian organization, or at least they are based in Brazil, and they were offering, and they have been offering actually for quite some time now, specific small grants for communities um, to access in it like into work on specific problems, and to fix some of those problems, but like in their small scale, you know. And I think initiatives like those, and assuming, and like I guess embracing, which, because that's also a policy, that's an expression of what we need to some extent these days, right? Like assuming that small changes like that, gestures of trust toward the trusting the communities with whom we work, um, and really like opening the space in with flexibility to give and to build something, like sort of putting aside bureaucracy, putting aside a lot of the obstacles that a lot of the time prevent policy from becoming real and from having real impact in like the lives of people. I think, well, that's not like a political, I don't know, like that's not a law or a decree, or it isn't in a formal political agenda. That's also political. And I think that uh, for example, just bringing that up, like bringing the end, like the donors or NGO perspective, and how they are changing their policies, and looking back at us and how we are changing our how we understand political life in our communities. I think I have way more hope in those smaller quote unquote structures. And I in my experience, I've seen that those are responding way more effectively than like these huge systemic change kind of trends that yeah, I think sometimes we tend to forget that the structures that brought us, that those were the structures that brought us here, right? That to some extent created this massive collapse, and I don't know how we can continue to trust them again to fix it, you know. So yeah.
No, I completely understand where you're coming from, and I've had a lot of discussions like this with activists, and even, you know, struggling myself with working against these seemingly all-powerful structures that act as barriers to equitable change, when you are working very much from like a grassroots or community basis, trying to fight upwards. And I've heard from activists specifically Indigenous activists on like the issue of reconciliation in Canada, for example. And I'm like, how do you keep doing this work if you don't have the if you can't see the measured outcomes that you're fighting for? And they're saying that, or some are saying anyways, that what they've decided to focus on is, as you've said, grassroots initiatives, because it produces tangible change that, you know, these workers, activists can see coming out of it. And so I think that is one solution that people are running with, is like, it's hard to fight systems, but if we start at the grassroots level, you know, we can avoid this burnout, we can avoid disillusionment in the advocacy project. But before I move on to you, Farah, Noli, some of your work is very much battling the huge structures of Chinese capital expansion in very much a community-based, you know, the Amazon in et cetera, Indigenous groups in the Amazon. And that's very much, you know, a David and Goliath situation. So how do you keep that fight going, even for yourself? Like, how do you avoid that burnout and that disillusionment when you are fighting such a large structure from such a smaller community space?
Yeah, I think that's a very complicated question, but I would say, what I will say is, like, I think it's not easy in general, but I think what I've learned from like working with Indigenous women and working with Indigenous girls too, because I for a while there I was focusing, and I continue to do so, on like Indigenous girls. What I've learned is that there are no easy answers, and that like trying to come up with one cohesive narrative that's going to bring us answers and clarity suddenly about like all the things and all the problems is probably a lie. It's probably not going to address the complexity of the problems. And actually they have taught me that to understand the ways in which life is being precarized, and I kind of want to go back to what Farah was saying like before about the community, and how like climate change is also, we're seeing, like, I don't know, there's a lot of parallels with what climate change is and will look like with COVID, right? And but yeah, what I guess I'm trying to say is there are no easy answers. I think settling with the discomfort of knowing that there is not there aren't like one way, like perfectly structured solutions, even explanations is key, you know, like understanding that it is an like an ever-changing reality. It's an ongoing thing. It's not done and gone, but rather it's showing us more and more and more expressions. And I think it's a particular expression, like the fact that the virus is mutating, for example, is a particular expression of how things are evolving all the time. We're in permanent changes, and we're gonna need to adapt to, and I think that's and to adapt, but not to adapt in the sense of sort of giving up and like kind of again sort of normalize it and roll with it, but rather to reimagine what life's gonna be like. In the case of like my studies about like this fight of two world hegemonies trying to dispute space like the Amazon, in we're too hegemonic, or too to, like, for example, like there's always this discussion, right, especially in the left, oh, China is kind of leading the world geopolitical, and they are disputing the world hegemony. And a lot of people say, no, it's the US, we continue to face the US. And so I think in my work, that has also like the understanding again of like going back to sometimes the intimacy, right? Like, what is our intuition? How are we feeling in these landscapes? How are those transformations in the everyday life? What are those things telling us about those huge, sometimes abstract geopolitical processes? And I think I am tying this with what I was saying about COVID, because I think it's that idea of like how can we settle in the discomfort of not necessarily coming up with a lot of questions, but rather making sure that we have the social fabric and structure that's gonna ensure that we can continue to work in, like, I don't know, the weird that are at the end of the day sustaining life. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I would be happy to clarify.
No, completely. I definitely followed that. And I do think that is the ultimate answer, is things are never simple. And yeah, that we need to be comfortable in that process. So Farah, if you have anything to build on in terms of the challenges in making change at the systemic level, I'm curious to hear, but I also would like to hear on a more personal level, in your own work and your own experience, what has change meant and looked for you, like, and how have you achieved that, be that systemic, be that grassroots, like what have you focused on in your work, and how have you been able to accomplish that?
While I was listening to Noelle, I was thinking that that's the bigger macro picture, and sometimes the macro picture can get grim. So I draw inspiration from the micro level, and what happened during the COVID, with the initial months of the outbreak. I mean, as the head of an organization where there are 400 staff, I applied my feminist leadership. My approach to prioritizing the well-being of the staff in the organization, flexibility, being agile, looking at how we repurpose, how we work, and a big, almost 60% of my work of the team is with Rohingya refugees in a place called Cox's Bazar. So it is extremely, in any circumstances, very difficult, because that community, with all its uncertainties, are going through their own set of traumas. And when it's a humanitarian program, but it's a protracted humanitarian program. So it's challenging on many fronts. And then you suddenly have lockdowns and misinformation, and you don't know where to go. And so the whole first 6 months, my effort was to try and keep the staff, the members of this organization, their motivation, their providing information. Not that I knew anything about it. So I learned, they learned, we learned together, and we tried to address some of this, and we tried not to get detracted by misinformation or the social media, because the good side, of course, is there, but there's also a lot and everybody suddenly became a health expert. Everybody was an expert on virus and pandemic and so on. So it's very confusing. And in a country where the literacy rate is measured by numeracy and knowing your numbers, but generally people are not highly, there's still a lot to do in the education sector. So then that was one major part. And I thought that comparing Action 8 countries, we are in 48 countries. I felt that at the end of it, we not only were able to work and turn things around, we became very successful. And we were able to work with the community, changed our program approach, focused on what was needed at the moment, how to support them, trauma, psychosocial counseling, skills development, having sessions with young people. So then also this was an opportunity, because the government and policymakers, they were in the process of developing a 5-year plan or the stimulus package. And we were able to lobby with them and get those changed, so that the stimulus package was not only for the rich businesses, but also how they can think about doing something for the informal sector and so on. And we found that the Prime Minister also took up some of these issues. So in that sense, it was an opportunity to be able to influence and do advocacy and be the catalyst, create platforms for young people and bring them, the digital platforms made it easy for young people to have those conversations and to be able to do their lobbying. We made sure that they were there in those platforms. So that was how we managed to go through, I think, most of 2020 and 2021. And for me, I felt that, I was able to be decisive and take those actions. If I was only looking for guidance from someone else or a prescription for someone else, then I might have lost this opportunity. So if you come to my organization now, you'll find the morale and the spirit of the team so high, which is really, I will say, very rewarding. And that has been possible because of intuition, all the qualities, principles that you see as a feminist or as a feminist leader.
I don't know.
Please,
I don't know,
Natalie.
Kaylee, if I can just say one thing. I think
Of course.
it's fascinating what Farah is saying, because like I feel like the pandemic also offered that for me as and for my organization as an opportunity. And I think I never before had appreciated more the opportunity to step back, like this idea, this sense of like, hey, and Farah was saying this from the very beginning, we need to stop. We didn't like that kind of forced pause was so important for us to redefine a lot of things, how we were imagining our work-life balance, right? Like how we were imagining the work and like the projects that we wanted to work on. How were we imagining like what we wanted to implement? Like a lot of us thought for a sec, like for example, for us, it was we're focused primarily. We work particularly with Indigenous women, basically Indigenous women, but also some peasant women as well. And for us, it was a very eye-opening moment to say, hey, you know what? Yes, I mean, that work is essential, and we need to start conversations about what they are needing. And that opened like a whole separate tone of like, hey, you know what? Like there isn't, and I guess, like there isn't, this is not a specific project that we're talking about. So we don't, there's room for like actually exploring what the communities need. But it was also eye-opening in the sense, and in their own terms, like I just want to emphasize that, like how they were saying like, hey, this is what we need. Like what we need not to go to the nearby towns all the time, because that's exposing us, and that's what's causing the death of a lot of our elders, and understanding that, like and not rolling with the, I don't know, like World Health Organization that everyone should be wearing a mask, because not all the regulations made sense in like every scale and every place in the same way, right? Like, so there were different needs, and opening the space to talk about that. But on the other hand, it was eye-opening to see how we realized that there was a very big need to work where we were living, and like how can we like sort of look at ourselves, because there's also this tendency of looking at the other and like, hey, you know what, like what's happening over there. But then we realized what's happening here, what is happening in our households, what's happening in our neighborhoods, what's happening in like or like, I don't know, or the nearby neighborhoods. And that has actually sparked a lot of discussions in my organization, and that has led to new engagements with women that are in a situation of homelessness, and their kids. How can we heal from this huge pain, right? Like how can we address and like account and attend these huge grieving processes that have been there before, but now that are now, and because of the impossibility of, for example, going to the Amazon, they are forcing us to do what is needed in our locations, and like situate ourselves and think locally too, that has been for me a very, and for us, I gotta say, a very important thing. And I just want to add one last thing, and it's like and it's how that notion of like looking at ourselves has allowed us to be self-critical too, right? Like and realize that sometimes we actually probably could have been doing better. Like there was a moment in which we felt so overwhelmed about, like, I don't know, we were sending supplies to the Amazon because they weren't able to get like the medications that they thought they needed. They requested specific things, and when we got that overwhelmed, we realized, like, wait a second, like, yes, this is like, we need to make sure this works for them. Like, we need to make sure that these supplies that we're sending are gonna get there on time and in a safely manner. But it was also a moment in which we saw, or at least I saw, how how that exercise and how so much pressure was overtaxing a lot of the members of my own team. And it was this incredibly complicated moment where I was unable to go back home because I live in the United States, and they were struggling on their own over there. And like, it was just such a complicated moment that forced us to step back and really reimagine and like redefine what we wanted to be as an organization and where we were heading towards. So yeah.
No, that's brilliant. And you've both kind of spoken to in different ways the lessons that have been learned, or the opportunities that have come with, Noli, as you said, this forced pause, which it very much has been. Farah, you were talking about how this has been an unprecedented opportunity for platform building for young people to establish and work on their own platforms digitally. And Noli, you talked about reassessing the projects that we want, or that organizations want to take on, refocusing on the local, and also the opportunity to be self-critical, to ask if we could have been doing better, if we should have been doing better. From your guys' perspectives, like moving out onto kind of from the local to the more global context, obviously, if we hold true that past crises provide the opportunity for reflection and lessons and change to come from these sweeping global events at the local level, as you guys have talked about. But what do you think about the global community? What lessons do you think have been learned? What do you think will change? I mean, everything from the use of social media and the power and dangers within those realms to, what the role of different actors are in the global system, NGOs, public institutions, et cetera. Yeah, I'm curious to hear, you've talked about the lessons you've learned and your organizations have learned during the pandemic, but either of you, whoever wants to kick us off, what do you think are the global lessons that the community has learned?
I think, unfortunately, the reality check is that we still live in the patriarchal world. There is gendered differences. The priority of the global leadership is inward looking. Nationalism and this whole vaccine politics it makes it very clear. And also it's so disturbing to see that over so many 2-3 decades, there's been the conversation about climate change and ecology and environment and disaster. But everybody kind of they keep debating on it. And then now the IPCC recent report said it, that it's burning. It's you're not going to be able to, unless you act right now. There's really no more opportunity, no more time left to do anything. So and they're still debating. So I mean, I guess, like Greta Thunberg has been saying, it's all blah blah blah. I mean, it's unfortunate because I've been to all these negotiations and spent hours discussing the I's and the T's that they're going to cut and the brackets in the negotiation. That mentality has not changed. And we also see that the tech companies, there are some sectors which have made billions, but they don't see the responsibility of coming forward and supporting communities or supporting countries who are really in need. So we have a number of serious issues in front of us. There's going to be displacement because of climate change. There is already displacement because of conflict, and conflicts which are created by international politics and geopolitics, and then they are fanned and they are kept alive because it serves somebody's purpose. My last point would be that the reality check has been that it's all rhetorics about we want localization, we want to support women's rights, we want to talk about LGBT. Basically, investment in that area is not forthcoming. Localization is more rhetoric than real. And we will actually have to come together and hold our local and national governments also accountable and take that to the international level. What I found in Bangladesh's experience is whatever evidences we could demonstrate and we could show adaptation and innovation, the government picked it up. And then, of course, it puts its own footprint and says, it's our idea. The whole, we are an example of early warning, resilience, and all this, and the government goes and celebrates at different levels, which is fine, because at the end of the day, it's what is the result. If we need to keep doing that, and we need to put the accountability on the top of our agenda. Accountable in terms of the gender discriminations that they're having, removing some of the practices that exist, and the system has to change. Now, whenever we talk about system, the governments or the state machines, it's an elephant, you can't move it, and so on. That we have to show that we have started moving at the local level. Those changes, if you add them. My only concern is that the political leaders celebrate how resilient the communities are and how they bounce back. My point is that I was in poverty. I went down the poverty level. And do you want me to bounce back to being in the poverty level? No. So it has to be really not rhetorics, but build back better. And no harm policy. It has to be a whole of the society approach. The vaccine, if there's the virus, the pandemic, if there's one lesson is no one is safe unless all of us are safe.
And I think, yeah, this is just a theme that's building into our conversation here, is the focusing on local efforts and grassroots movements, and trying to avoid the pitfalls of, as Greta says, the blah, blah, blah from bureaucrats and global leaders. Before we move on to our Q&A from the audience, Noli, do you have anything you want to build up on that conversation?
Yes, actually, yes. I think what Farah is bringing up is super important, because I think that COVID and I think climate change are two amazing crisis examples that show us that in reality, and I want to continue with the idea of unmasking, there's this exercise of unmasking that it's actually we've been living in a world where politicians pretended that they cared, and in a global scale, what in reality happened is that COVID unmasked the fact that it was all a performance. And if one thinks of politics lately, with certain prominent political figures that have definitely changed the world, I'm thinking of, I don't know, Donald Trump being a very particular figure. I think it's the horror that it caused all the time is that he actually, for example, just to use him as an example, but he actually the main thing that he was doing is not like he stopped pretending that he cared. In that alone is like, it's such an important thing, because in reality, and we can see it now, right? Like very little, like structurally speaking, there are no radical differences. And I think that's something that we should think about more. And I also want to build on what Farah was saying about like how some of the political, like some of the systemic change discourse sometimes becomes like it creates a distance between the people and like the system, right? And I think it has to do, or there is a risk rather, with these processes, like with COVID, for example, that has sort of made the whole crisis about a technical issue, when in reality it was always about when turning political issues into technical ones, into like in making them really small, in like, in sort of creating a division in distracting from what actually needs to be discussed. And I think the internet plays a huge role there, and that would probably be a whole separate discussion, right? Because when we think of the global scale, like hell, COVID has shown us that literally the global scale is in big part or for the most part, frankly, during lockdown, in like on the internet, right? Like, and how do we understand new expressions of geopolitics? How we understand new expressions of power on the internet, that also an internet that offers and gives us this sensation that we are all super connected, but that in reality it's atomizing us, and in keeping each one of us with like sitting in front of our screens. So yeah, I think I'd leave it at that.
Completely. And I like how you said, we've been distracting from what needs to be discussed, and the internet, I think, has a dual role in making this more of an issue and also refocusing us. So it's kind of the dual nature of that platform. With only 5 minutes left, we're going to go into some questions from the audience. We have 2 of them, and I think I'm gonna do one each. So Noli, I'll point this one to you first. So this question is, one of the themes we heard yesterday was around grief in the time of COVID, and there is collective grief and emotional impacts to this pandemic. How do we make space for that and incorporate that into our localized grassroots work? And I'm intrigued to hear about your perspective on that, having done emergency emotional support in the Amazon. So please.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times we focus so much on like the solutions and like the discussions around the huge scale, or what it means, what COVID meant in like a broader scale, and I wonder if we had time to actually sit and like grieve, like the fact that like the world, like on a planetary scale, just like lost so much, so like I personally know a lot of people whose family members passed away. I mean, some family members of mine passed away. Like there's this and I think grief, like if we for a second there stop and think about grief, and like that's also gonna throw some coordinates for us to navigate what's coming. Because, and again, I go back to this idea of the intuition, right? Like I think there have been several layers in expressions of harm, and sometimes really like focusing on what this meant emotionally speaking for the planet is a very crucial fact. And regarding the work in the Amazon, I think the work in the Amazon with emotional relief is particularly challenging because of the lack of, again, internet connection. There's a lot of technical difficulties there that had made a little bit harder to implement a lot of the creative and like the most powerful techniques that we thought we could implement and that we would usually do in person. I think that that has, again, for them, and I think it has been a really nice process to see how we cannot pretend that or rather that the social process is like healing grief or like strengthening the social fabric would depend on us, that we don't even live there. So I think that which it never did, it was always a process that the Amazonian communities were taking by themselves. But it was super interesting to say, hey, you know what, like, I don't, like, at this time it is impossible for us to probably go and facilitate certain, I don't know, even a workshop, right? And now it's very much like an opportunity for you all to reimagine and to rewrite your own I guess processes of healing, right? And I think and soon it's coming, the first General Assembly of the Indigenous Women in one specific region in the Amazon. It's coming, they're organizing, and they're gonna talk about COVID and how COVID impacted their lives, and I think it's so beautiful because really their agendas in how they're thinking about, like, and I recently, like 2 days ago, I received a call from one of the women that's organizing, and she was like telling me, we realized, there's so much we need to talk, like this has like changed everything. We're going to rewrite our principles as like a women's organization. We need to talk a lot more about our how we're feeling now that there's also this sense of, in this huge discourse on post-pandemic, when like I don't where, like post-pandemic, where, like for
there.
whom exactly? We're not even close to being there. Like in a country where in Bolivia, like less than 30% of the population is fully vaccinated. Like what post-pandemic world are we talking about, And so I think but yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to do, especially in terms of, again, like the technical difficulties prompt a lot of questions and like a lot of action around autonomy too, and like how we can like autonomously, independently create spaces to heal, right? To heal in a community-based way.
For sure.
Yeah.
No, I like how you talk about healing and grief as these social processes that require autonomous, independent, and also local space. Absolutely. So we only have 1 minute left. So Farah, I'm so sorry, because this is a great question, but if you could give us your best 1 minute thought on this. But we have a question from the audience saying that you said rural areas of Bangladesh were more prepared for the pandemic. What do you think that larger, more urban countries can learn from rural communities about pandemic preparedness?
I may have been misunderstood. They were not prepared for the pandemic, but they were prepared in terms of receiving the informal sector people going back because of our agriculture and the farmers, and there being a certain level of food security, not the health side of the health infrastructure or services or vaccines were not. So when I said they were better prepared, it was like when suddenly people didn't have any jobs, suddenly they didn't have any accommodation, students had to leave the camps because there was lockdown. Where did they go back? They went back to the rural areas. But this question could be framed slightly, or I could answer slightly differently. Bangladesh is known for its resilience and early warning and preparedness. So there's been a lot of investment at community level to prepare them for disasters, and they first of all, they have very little demands, and secondly, this exercise of being prepared for disasters, they applied that to the pandemic. And also there were major social awareness campaigns in Bangladesh around diarrhea, around family planning services. That has helped people to take up this issue. So I think, and the simple answer would be the preparedness, the awareness, and social campaigns would help the communities in urban areas to deal with it. But if you have limited resources, then you are challenged, and you will have to best use the resources you have. And I think pandemic did stop us for a moment to think of what we are consuming. Do we really need this much? The sustainable consumption and also a little bit of the production did come into our mind, and best use of the resources we have. I know it's just a minute, so I won't get into it, but perhaps we can have other opportunities. And I would say the strength of the nation, of the community, lies in women's adaptation, how women
Absolutely.
immediately stepped in and adjusted and adapted to all this. So that is our strength. And I think that's a strength in every community, whether they're in urban, rural, how with little resources, with the major challenges, they manage to survive and exist.
Absolutely. And I think we will have more time to talk about that in the conversation to follow this keynote, but thank you for trying to answer that big question in under a minute. So I just want to thank you both so much for making this time here. It has been such a privilege to get to sit down and talk to both of you. I'm incredibly in awe and humbled to be the moderator for such a great group of panelists. Right before I turn it over to Jennifer, I know Noli wants to share one last quote for the group, and then I will turn it over to Jennifer. So
yeah, thank you,
Kelly.
thank you so much for this whole space. I just wanted to bring up like the words of Arundhati Roy that always that helped me so much deal with the pandemic, like the stress of the pandemic, and I'm gonna read it because I think it's so beautiful. Arundhati Roy in 2003 said, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And I think that's such a powerful thing to say, and that I would like to invite us all to sit and think what that means. So thank you again.
amazing. Thank you, Noli. That's beautiful. Yes, thank you guys so much again. I look forward to our conversation afterwards, and I will turn it over to Jennifer now.
Okay, thank you so much, Kelly. You did a wonderful job. Your questions were so insightful. And Noli and Farah, thank you so much for your inspirational words as well. I loved your quote at the end, Noli. That was really beautiful. You talked a lot about systems change and the complexities of that. I was thinking about some of the earlier panel discussions that we've had and noting how many parallels there are and that we're hearing amongst all of the different speakers. But I think one important takeaway for me is just about the value, the importance and the inspiration that we can draw from grassroots, locally led, small scale change. And I think that for me, hearing the two of you speak about your very important work, it's inspirational to me to hear about that, and I'll take that forward with me in the work that I'm doing when I feel overwhelmed and scared. And I think Noli, you were talking about having to sit with that discomfort. I think it's important to think about the positive things that are happening around the world, done by women, as you noted, Farah. And I think that for me, this has been a really, really valuable conversation to be able to listen to. So thanks to the three of you for this discussion.